I'd like to open with a word of prayer. O Holy Spirit, creator of all things, we thank you for letting us be here today, to be able to open our eyes and see the wonderful and the beauty that you bring to us each day. Creator, we pray for this country, that you will take things in your hands and our leadership, guide and direct them in the right ways. We pray for those families that have lost loved ones and friends, that you will strengthen their souls and heal their hearts. The ones that come and bring message to us today, their knowledge, their wisdom, and their thoughts, that we all will learn from it and take it with us. And as the day comes to an end, we ask that you, the ones that came from near and far, that you would take them back on their journey safely. We ask all these things in the great Creator's name.
Good morning. I'm Chief Ann Richardson. It is my pleasure to host this event. Our tribe has worked on this for about 6 months, and we've been very blessed to have an array of brilliant scholars that have come to help us do this event. And this is an important historic event. The federally recognized tribes of Virginia feel that it is time for our sovereignty to be recognized by the state of Virginia as well as the United States government. And this is an opportunity for us to highlight our histories, our treaties, our hopes and dreams for the future of our people, to forge a better relationship, one where our sovereignty is acknowledged by the Commonwealth of Virginia, one that is done in good faith, that creates the diplomacy that affords sovereign nations, and to bring forth more understanding and a better working relationship, creating protocols for how things should be done, establishing those protocols now for the future generations of our tribes. And I thank you all for being here. I would like now to introduce the chiefs of the tribes that are here present with us. And good morning to our online audience as well. We thank you for joining us. We appreciate you supporting this event. I will start with Chief Frank Adams here. Wade Frank, of the Upper Mattaponi tribe, they are located in King William County, and we appreciate all the hard work that their tribe has put into both the federal recognition process that we all went through for 20 years and also for this event. And Chief Kenneth Branham is next, of the Monacan Indian Nation. They're in Amherst County, Virginia. We appreciate them, and the same sentiments for all of the 25 years that we've all worked together. And we have Chief Robert Gray of the Pamunkey Reservation in King William, Virginia. Thank you, Bobby, for supporting this important event and being with us and supporting us for our federal recognition. And then we have Chief Earl Bass of the Nansemond Nation, and they're located in Chuckatuck, Virginia. And we are so pleased to have you with us today and your entourage that you have brought. So let's have a hand for the tribes and the chiefs of Virginia. Well, speaking of those amazing scholars that we have been blessed to have, and I'm going to, you've got them in your program, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about them, the morning session that we're going to have. And just for a moment of housekeeping, the restrooms are out the back and to the left, and we will have lunch at noon out here, and it will be buffet. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before I forget about it when I'm talking about other things. And so I want to introduce the morning group that's going to be coming in, the panelists that are going to be speaking on the various aspects of our history and of treaties and of the importance of the Accord. We have been blessed with Dr. Jessica Taylor, who is going to be your first speaker. She is Assistant Professor of Oral and Public History at Virginia Tech. Jessica, could you stand, please? And Jessica, if you would just come on up here right now. And as I finish the rest of these, we have Dr. Ed Reagan, who has been a historian for the tribe for 25 years and has done research for us to help us more completely tell our story, things that had been hidden and things that had been lost. He's our prime investigator. And so, Ed Reagan, we thank you Dr. Ed Reagan, excuse me. And then we have Dr. Jason Sellers. Jason is an associate professor at Mary Washington University. So give him a hand. We thank you all so much for the work that you've been doing. We also have a special guest that you will see this afternoon, and I will introduce him this afternoon. Oh, where's Sam? Oh, there you are. You're standing. And we have Dr. Sam Cook, who is infamous with the Virginia tribes and has been working for as long as I can remember, like 25 or 30 years, toward this day, and working with the tribes to recapture their history, to put forth programs that educate our children, that host Native Nations, which is an organization that supports the building of tribal nations or the rebuilding of tribal nations. And he has been involved in the education summits at Virginia Tech for the Native Americans for many, many years, and we are blessed to have him. Can we get a hand for Dr. Sam Cook? Okay, Jess, come on.
Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you for the thumbs up. Well, I'm Jessica Taylor, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the ways that social relationships between Native, Chesapeake, and Piedmont and Mountain peoples, and what we now know as the Commonwealth of Virginia, and English colonists have created boundaries around sovereignty and created challenges for people that would like to hold on to their land and freedom. So to begin, I want to talk about how Anglo-Native treaties and English neglect of agreements with Native people shape society and social inequality in the Commonwealth in ways that historians are only beginning to explore. The colony treaties of 1646 and 1680, and many local legal documents and treaties between Native leaders and Englishmen, informed how Native people confronted colonialism. However, the treaties were consistently at odds with how colonists and Native people treated one another as neighbors, and how they battled over land and sovereignty. Native knowledge of the landscapes of the Chesapeake and Piedmont and mountains and their creative strategies for maintaining and deepening their ties to them and to one another helped them weather this chapter of history. And today I'm going to talk primarily about the 17th century. However, failures in the stipulations and enforcement of 17th century treaties were crucial to patterns of displacement and violence. For Native people from the Gulf of Mexico to the Puget Sound, water is the connective tissue between nations, offering alliance and goods to one another. In this part of North America, the eastern woodlands is especially riparian. Before English colonists settled on the James River, an extensive network of alliances and agreements within and beyond the modern bounds of Virginia enriched everyday life for Native people, Algonquians, and Siouan-speaking people. Roads parallel to local watercourses, which you can see here, and the watercourses themselves connected settlements and neighboring chiefdoms. While there are few written mentions, Native people maintained and engineered new agreements and alliances throughout the 16th and 17th centuries inside of the Powhatan Chiefdom and the Monacan Alliance, which I'm sure you'll hear about a lot today. Rivers and overland trade routes ran into the Piedmont and past the mountains, connecting the coast to the wider continent. The Powhatans, about whom we know the most, were accustomed to trading with newcomers, people of differing governments, cultures, and languages. They received trade goods from as far afield as the Great Lakes and ostensibly Spanish-occupied indigenous places to the south. They also, like the English, traveled hundreds of miles as mariners in dugout canoes, in the Algonquians' cases, to make war and trade seasonally. So these are well-traveled, cultured people, not what we're used to thinking about as provincial. The colonists arrived on the Powhatan, or now the James River, a central artery of the Powhatan's chiefdom. The chiefdom was called Senecomico, and its capital was Werowocomico, to the north on the modern-day York River. Verbal agreements and the exchange of gifts provide a tentative start to English-Algonquian alliances and establish expectations for how newcomers should behave and where they ought to settle. In the initial years, Wahun Seneca, the paramount chief called Powhatan by the English, made careful efforts to incorporate the English into Senecomico and to gain knowledge of how the newcomers might interact with their new home. He sent an emissary named Nemontac on a fact-finding mission to England. He incorporated John Smith into his chiefdom, probably as a son, and he conducted diplomacy from his capital, fostering a generation of young people, native and English, as interpreters. Simultaneously, native protocol required that the English also visit and establish relationships with the independent Chickahominy and the 30-plus smaller chiefdoms inside of Senecomico, some of whom were delighted by the promise of trade, and others who felt that the English threatened their autonomy. The Chickahominies loaded the English ships with corn in exchange for trade goods, for example, while the Monacans refused to trade or provide help for the English, signaling a disinterest in brokering agreements with the newcomers. Because they interacted little with the English at this point, archives have revealed even less, but the Monacan strategy of seclusion from efforts to extract from and colonize their territory ensured centuries of survival. While independent nations obviously decided the extent of their own engagement, chiefdoms paying tribute to the Powhatan also had leeway to decide the nature of their relationship with the newcomers. Groups like the Appomattox, which you can see here from John Smith's map, were initially cool in their engagement with the English. The colonist agreements with the Paspahegh, Werowance, Wawinchapunk in 1607, for example, ultimately decided that the colonists could stay in their territory at the now iconic James Fort. For those who engaged, however, the formalities of gift-giving and forming alliances were also moments to learn from and about one another. Well-traveled people like Wahun Seneca's brother, Opechancanough, held conversations with the English about compasses and celestial navigation, while Wahun Seneca took interest in prestige goods and grindstones, swords, and guns. The English, of course, took interest in Algonquian women's corn and cooking. Archaeological evidence of native women's pots proliferates in James Fort, perhaps used by native women inside of English hearts. Based in English dependence, these were opportunities to build both goodwill, but also intelligence that would inform diplomatic strategies in the future. Algonquians along the Chesapeake were well prepared to deal with violations of agreements and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The English accused Algonquians of being, quote, great thieves when they rectified imbalances by grabbing in front of the English what the English had failed to provide in the spirit of reciprocity: firearms, hatchets, dishes, copper, and other goods of value to them. On a broader scale, though, Wahun Seneca had worked over the previous decades to bring recalcitrant chiefdoms into his orbit through violent displacement and other tactics. And so he responded to John Smith's own threats of violence with a reminder of the Powhatan's better footing on the landscape and their knowledge of Chesapeake resources, but also the English dependence on native people. What can you get by war when we can hide our provisions and fly to the woods? Where you must famish by wronging us, your friends. Part of his role as paramount chief, after all, had been protecting his people from outsider violence from nations from the north and the west. English attempts to bargain for more corn from the Nansemons, for example, and from the town of Powhatan in 1609, and their attacks and desecration of sacred religious sites when they didn't receive it, led to dozens of English deaths. Wahun Seneca ordered to cut off trade and negotiation with the people at James Fort, and that led to many more deaths. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, which was fought from 1609 to 1614, and the starvation of the colonists in its initial years, demonstrated the consequences of diplomatic isolation in a place native people know so much better. A different kind of agreement and alliance, the marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe in 1614, which I'm sure you're familiar with, helped end the conflict through a kinship protocol understood by both the Powhatans and the English. Individual Englishmen relying on native food production formed their own separate agreements with Werowances, or headmen or chiefs, largely to the detriment of Anglo-Powhatan relations. Hungry English traders and interpreters searching for corn beyond Jamestown faced little accountability for their actions and proved themselves untrustworthy. One trader, John Martin, abandoned his men during war with the Powhatans in 1609 and beat a course back to James Fort for safety. And the desperate soldiers he left behind attempted to take food from the Nansemans, and the Nansemans killed them and stuffed their mouths with bread. A decade later, in 1619, John Martin robbed Eastern Shore people, who had been friends to the English, of their corn during an especially lean year. But because his settlement was not represented by the Burgesses, he was not bound to follow Jamestown's laws, or by extension, their agreements with Native people, which is something that a lot of folks don't understand about this early period. The Burgesses recognized the danger to relations posed by men like Martin and made him promise to do better. But their efforts to prohibit the trade in guns and other English goods, even dogs, flew in the face of reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that English and Native people lived, traded, and worked with each other along the Chesapeake's waters every day by this point. As the English staked out tobacco-growing settlements like John Martin's, moving up the James River to modern-day Richmond, and almost doubled in number from 1619 and 1622 due to immigration, they threatened the Powhatans' carefully cultivated network of alliances and control over the Chesapeake. First, they could not be trusted to be consistent and honest in their alliances with constituent chiefdoms, which was the case with John Martin. Then they circumnavigated Powhatan control of the trade in valuable goods like copper. They began to treat with people on the outer edges of the Powhatan chiefdom, including on the Eastern Shore and Potomac River, without Powhatan leave. And they threatened control over fertile land far beyond their settlement in Paspahegh and James Fort. These exact offensive factors and native communication and intelligence of English settlement also made a correction to the imbalance easy. Similar to the Powhatan's treatment of threatening chiefdoms before colonization, a coordinated attack led by Opechancanough on Englishmen and their ironworks, cattle, and homes in 1622 destroyed outlying settlements, forcing survivors to relocate east. The resulting decade-long Anglo-Powhatan War led to the dissolution of the famous Virginia Company that had supported Jamestown and ended in a peace treaty in 1632 since lost to historians. As Englishmen claimed land on the northern neck and middle peninsula, Opechancanough led a second attack in 1644 that was just as deadly. In both cases, Native leaders did not intend for the extermination of the English, but ceased large-scale attacks after the initial surprise because their actions were intended as a corrective to the English violations of their agreement. On the other hand, Englishmen wreaked havoc on native towns and women's crops and resorted to trickery, like when Englishmen and native allies with the Patawomecs poisoned and ambushed the Powhatans who met with them to treat. While until 1646, conflicts with Native people had ended in either truces or stalemates, the violence and English predations on Algonquin women's cornfields forced the migration of Native people along the James and York rivers from their home territories. Differing Native choices for survival, from allying with the English to migrating to making uneasy peace, meant that there were not two sides to this conflict, to these series of conflicts, but instead several. However, many historians argue that the Anglo-Powhatan Wars produced a degree of hopelessness, that English and Native ideas about reciprocity, treaties, and trading were not and could not be compatible. The conclusion of the final Anglo-Powhatan War in 1646 produced a written treaty outlining the future of social relationships between Algonquins and Englishmen as the English envisioned them. The treaty first established the tributary status of the Powhatans, then drew a long line down the York River with Native people on the north side and English people on the south side, despite the fact that Englishmen had long sailed, treated, and eyed land north of the York River. Future diplomatic protocol would occur at Jamestown, where tribute of beaver skins, a valuable trade good sold in Europe, for hats, where tribute of beaver skins, a valuable trade good, would be delivered yearly. The treaty demanded social and economic separation, with a special burden placed on Native people to uphold it. Native people found without a badge or a special striped coat on English lands would suffer death. Englishmen on Native land would be judged as felons. Native people could find the striped coats at strategic English forts, which were set up along Virginia's major rivers, manned by Englishmen who then profited from those forts' locations along Native trade routes and, of course, the land surrounding the forts. Exceptions to the social separation of Native people and Englishmen included Native children, who were welcome in English homes, ostensibly to educate them, but more likely as laborers. Tributary status allowed Englishmen to lay claim to Native connections, places, and families to their own ends. These claims of ownership and exclusion were in many cases only expressions of desire on the parts of Englishmen, in or out of Virginia's claimed territory, but also former allies like the tributaries and the Patawomecs and Eastern Shore, who had since broken away. Nicotowens, who was the leader at this point, complained, "My countrymen tell me I am a liar when I tell them the English will kill you if you go into their bounds, even as an English soldier, quote, made him no liar when lately he killed 3 Indians without badges encroaching." Clearly, even some of Nicotowens' countrymen were uninterested in the letter of the law. Nicotowens' statement shows that the reality on the ground developed quite differently from English leadership's visions across the Chesapeake. First, much of this new territory that the English claimed was aspirational. English settlements were often distant from one another by design, so that they wouldn't fight among each other, and Englishmen often deliberately picked Native women's fields as prime settlement spots, trusting that early farmers had cleared good land. That left space, albeit dangerous, for Native people to continue to travel roads and access resources that had long sustained life and relationships. Indeed, into the 18th century, evidence suggests that Englishmen also encouraged Native people to cross those boundaries even as their leaders put them in place, relying on Native people to employ their knowledge of Virginia to provide medicine and food like meat, fish, and now staples of Southern cooking, like hominy for their plantations, and to guide their trade and exploration into the Piedmont Mountains and the Northern Bay. However, after the final Anglo-Powhatan War, English expansion increased to the north and the northwest of Jamestown, cutting into the land marked for Native people by that treaty in the 1650s and 1660s. Native leaders made treaties with county officials and landowners, but living near the English often proved unbearable. Unfenced English livestock threatened Native women's fields. Englishmen burnt down a Werowance's home. Servants murdered Native people they met on the road. And unscrupulous landowners accused Native leaders of murder in order to unseat them. The result was that in order to remain in a familiar place, Native people made new treaties and moved frequently, sometimes between counties and colonies, to sustain themselves and to avoid conflict. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that despite the conflict, lifeways endured for people along the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. So did Native corrections to English misuse of the landscape, even as disputes increasingly ended up in county courts rather than in Native towns. Since the 1620s, for example, Accomack leaders on the Eastern Shore had carefully traded corn to the English and sold select pieces of land to interpreters and traders, contouring where Englishmen could and could not settle and how they could interact with their Native neighbors. Governor William Barclay recognized the value of these Native allies after Opechancano's 1640 attack, writing, "We cannot reasonably hope for the like effect of their friendship in case we should again need it, unless we abstain from acts of rapine and violence." When wronged by Englishmen, people on the Eastern Shore pursued justice through county courts and through long-accepted Native forms. During one spectacular incident in 1644, the Werowance and great men of the town of Great Metomkin on the Eastern Shore visited their neighbor John Dye, who may have occupied land he purchased from the Indians before it was actually paid for and patented. One great man tried to take Dye's axe, and some held him on the ground by the hair of the head and put dirt in his mouth and ears, while the rest literally tore down his house in front of him. Once the structure lay in pieces, at the Werowance's cue, they left with no further violence to person or property. The tactile symbolism of the suffocating dirt and the fallen house indicate that the Native people's anger that Dye claimed the ground and presumed to settle upon it without meeting an agreement, even if that agreement came in the form of an English legal document, shows their power. Controlling the type and extent of punishment empowered headmen to take English ideas about property into their own hands. A different kind of property, bonded labor, and accompanying racial divides also relied on Native people's land and formal subjection under tributary status. After 1619, a number of planters and traders invested in African labor and relied on enslaved people and indentured servants to work their plantation. Native people were forced to negotiate this hallmark of Southern society. Obviously, the sale and transformation of Indian land into profitable tobacco fields, starting in Virginia, saved the English presence in the mid-Atlantic and South and encouraged the intentional enslavement of millions of Africans and African Americans. Despite the treaties underscoring Powhatan identity as English subjects, English also enslaved Algonquians as part of a broader trend across the East Coast. It's estimated that around 50,000 Native people were enslaved by the Indian slave trade, not to mention children born into slavery or taken into servitude. After the 1646 treaty, English people began to claim and sell Indian children, some perhaps taken as captives in war beyond the Chesapeake, but still others taken from Native neighbors. At the same time, enslaved people from the Gulf of Mexico to New England circulated in the Caribbean and sometimes overland into Virginia. Beginning in the 1650s, English leaders passed laws again and again against the enslavement of tributary Indians and their Indian children, and the repetition is proof that illegal enslavement continued to occur. The increasing presence of slavery and Indian enslavement in particular, and increasingly hostile interactions between Native people and would-be English patentees north of the York River, led by the 1660s to enslavement of Algonquians as a tool to break diplomatic relationships with Native people, to exterminate entire nations and seize their land. When during a conflict with a number of nations, county officials in the northwest of Virginia sought to exterminate the Dogs, who had come south to Virginia after fallout from a Maryland treaty, one planter attempted to convince the governor to undertake a violent campaign against them. He says, quote, "It may be done without charge, for the women and children will defray it." At the turn of the 18th century, the Nanzaticos were rounded up and sent to Antigua in response to a murder of an English planter. Their land was then taken and used for tobacco. Native slavery in Virginia and its role in forced migration plays a key role in the development of Anglo-Native relations and in the larger history of the South. Finally, the treaty-making process forced Algonquians to take part in the policing of Native and non-Native bounded laborers. Since the founding of Jamestown, first colonists and servants and then enslaved people ran to Native towns to find refuge, a growing problem as English plantations expanded directly into Native territory. Nakatawance was to return all such enslaved people and guns as are yet remaining with him, and any that might come his way in the future, emphasizing the English designation of Africans as property. Stipulations about the return of Indian prisoners that shall hereafter run away, anticipating that Indians, Africans, and European indentured servants would escape from the English in the coming years, and they did. As tributaries to the English, Chesapeake Algonquians were now responsible for literally pursuing planters' interests through woods and fields, along their own networks and rivers appropriated by runaways and resistors. Treaties between counties and local landowners and nearby Native nations, particularly in the Northern Neck, repeat similar clauses again and again, demonstrating that Native people probably continued to shelter servants and enslaved people or transport them to safety out of the colony of Virginia. Today, this shows us that while English authorities in Jamestown might have written about Native people as if they were subjects, many of the people who saw them every day also recognized opportunity or threat, in the case of masters, in Native independence and connection beyond the Commonwealth's reach. Slaving, other trade, and political instability among other nations beyond the Commonwealth continue to threaten Native networks and well-being through the presence of outsider Native people. As tributaries, Native people were expected to provide a, quote, buffer between plantations and groups like the Five Nations and the Susquehannocks, but that made life precarious for Native people in the Commonwealth. Native leaders were also asked to assist county officials in investigations of Native attacks on settlement and were forced to fend off repeated rumors that they themselves were coordinating and planning violence. The buffer status of Native people also served land grabs. Landowners and county officials argued that their Algonquian neighbors were planning coordinated attacks with outsiders in violation of the peace in order to take their land. Englishmen then instigated violence and forced them to move. They often did a poor job in defending the, quote, friendly Indians. When a group later called the Rickahakians, which some argue were in alliance with the Monacans, settled at the falls of the James River in the 1650s, the Pamunkey and English teamed up to displace them, only for most of the Pamunkey men and their werowance Totopotomoy to be slain and the English leaders to be censured for their crimes and weaknesses. Other sources also point to the fact that the English refused to take care of Totopotomoy's family afterwards in violation of their agreement. For Native people affected by outsider captive taking and raids, a different kind of displacement occurred. In 1690, Stafford County officials captured a, quote, Seneca, and found that he had been captured 15 years earlier from his home along the Potomac River and taken away from the colony of Virginia. He had finally returned home after 15 years with the Five Nations and other peoples along the East Coast. Failure to address instabilities caused by enslavement and trade took Native land away from Native people and took Native people away from their land. Alongside a variety of other issues, including a lack of social mobility available to white men, land grants, and government spending, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 was caused by a culmination of unresolved tensions between colonizers and Native people over land and sovereignty. The Susquehannock War of 1675, caused by the death of friendly Susquehannocks, led to retaliatory raids on English plantations in northern Virginia. Colonist Nathaniel Bacon tapped into the resulting tension and led a cross-section of Virginians in a series of violent raids on Virginia's Algonquian people and people of the Piedmont in part of what is now today North Carolina. For over a year, they followed Native roads and rivers to burn Native trading towns, gather loot, murdering and enslaving people regardless of their nation, regardless of the previous agreement. Algonquians during this time period enacted strategies of seclusion in the riverine environment of the Chesapeake, using their knowledge of marshes and swamps to subsist and protect their people. The colonial government not only failed to protect or show up as allies to the tributary Indians, Native people once again protected themselves, but they demanded their help in putting down the rebellion, obviously met with a tepid response. In the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, colonial officials sought to pull control back to Jamestown from the colonies, which had made many of the unsuccessful treaties. They also sought to curtail the mobility and rights of non-white people, a key moment in the history of race in America taught in classrooms across the country today. The Treaty of Peace in 1677 once again confirmed Native ownership of land within 3 miles of their towns, required patents for Native lands, and reaffirmed Native rights to water access and hunting. Native people were to escort outsider Indians and runaways into the colony. As enslavement of Indians and Africans grew in Virginia, a new, harder boundary between Indians and Englishmen required enforcement from the places between the colony and the Native-dominated West. Pamunkey Werowansqua Kakakoeski, leader of the Pamunkey, also sought to centralize control over Native movements and boundaries. The colony seized traders' estates and redistributed their goods, including Native people enslaved in Bacon's Rebellion. Petitioning the new colonial government, Kakakoeski extricated all but 5 captives, like a woman returned at the colony's expense from Bermuda in 1682. She then secured the return of land stolen from the Pamunkey in the rebellion, as well as fishing and hunting rights. The relationship with the new Virginian government gave Kakakoeski new bargaining power and eased the process of pulling other Indians into the Pamunkey orbit to make them, quote, of the same mind and affection to His Majesty as herself. The Werowanskois signed the Treaty of Middle Plantation using the Pamunkey's historical authority over nations formerly part of the Powhatan chiefdom, quote, anciently and now again united under her subjection. After the final signatures were added to the Treaty of Middle Plantation in 1680, most Native people continued to interact with local landowners and people who lived on plantations with regularity, conducting diplomacy at the new capital at Williamsburg instead of Jamestown. Native people accustomed to trading with Englishmen immediately protested and then ignored the treaty's requirements that native trade happen in designated marts. Visitors to native towns could still expect diplomatic protocol, including the exchange of gifts, food, and guidance. They also continued to maintain ties to their native neighbors of different nation, allies for the doubtful years ahead. Colonists in the early 18th century noted shoulder tattoos used by tributary Indians to designate one nation from another. For Indians, the conclusion of Bacon's Rebellion changed little about their connection to one another and to the wider Native world and their struggle to claim power in the Chesapeake. In fact, Native people's knowledge of the interior proved crucial in dire times that followed. In the following years, outsider Native people came back to raid Virginia Plantation and surrounding Indian towns tributary to the colony. The situation only worsened when the Susquehannocks joined the Haudenosaunee, and the movement of these northern Indians proved difficult to track or predict. While writers at the end of the 17th century note diminished numbers of Native people, they also noted their knowledge of the Commonwealth and its resources, and the Native places and networks beyond, that made them powerful, disproportionate to their numbers in the society they made together. Historians now emphasize the story of the 18th century is not one of Indians versus Englishmen, but one of many different sides and people from discrete nations with different visions for the future. It is the work of future historians to understand the interconnected effects of treaties signed in Virginia or in New York, or New Spain, instead of discrete English colonies that have long served as the least common denominator unit of analysis. Native people in the Commonwealth have maintained power and enriched their lives through connection to others along the bay and upriver, and the damage of and resistance to colonialism likewise ripples outward.
I would like to apologize to the Chickahominy tribe and the Chickahominy Eastern Division of Chickahominy because I omitted them this morning. So we have Assistant Chief Reggie Stewart here from Chickahominy Western. And also Chief Jerry Stewart of Chickahominy Eastern is virtually with us this morning. Hi, Jerry, and rest of your tribe. Sorry about that. You know how forgetful I am. And so now we're going to have Dr. Ed Reagan, and he is going to enlighten you with more history. That was just amazing. Thank you so much for that. Ed, you want to come on over?
When we talk about treaty negotiations and diplomacy, this is something that has happened in Native America since long before Europeans arrived. And it was recorded that before any stranger entered into the village, the Werowance, there we go. The Werowance, or the Werowanskois, these were the chiefs of the village, welcomed about a quarter or a half mile out of town at the woods or water's edge with a tobacco ceremony. It was their way of receiving strangers and distinguishing whether they come as friends or enemies, though they do not understand each other's language. Across the eastern woodlands, tobacco was the key ingredient for most ritual action, including diplomacy and treaty making. William Strachey called its use botanomantia, or divination by plants. Thomas Harriot noted that tobacco is of so precious estimation amongst them that they think their gods and are marvelously delighted therewith. Mats were laid out, and the strangers invited to sit down upon those mats. And once seated, the Werowance presented a pipe of peace that was much larger and bigger than the common tobacco pipe. This pipe was always filled with tobacco before the face of the strangers and lit. And once lit, the Werowance, to whom the strangers had come, takes 2 or 3 whiffs and then hands it to the chief of the strangers. If the stranger refuses to smoke it, then 'tis a sign of war. If it be peace, the chief of the strangers takes a whiff or 2 of the pipe and presents it to the next great man of the town. After he, taking 2 or 3 whiffs, gives it back to the next of the strangers, and so on alternately until they pass all persons of note on each side. And then the ceremony is ended. And after a little discourse, they march together in friendly manner into the town and then proceed to explain the business upon which they came. My point in all this is to say that through ritual, the Werowance assessed the strangers to determine if it was safe to allow them to come inside his village. Through mediation, the Werowance sought to balance the known and the unknown. The Werowance's spiritual power was tested as he attempted to incorporate outsiders. The goal of a successful ceremony was to establish a balance between the familiar and the strange. And such a balance of power promoted peace and opened reciprocal networks of exchange, which facilitated diplomacy and treaty making. The goal of treaty making was to open these reciprocal networks. These reciprocal exchange networks ensured a continuous flow of goods and ideas throughout the region. And those networks, like treaties, had to be continuously maintained to ensure their survival. The purpose of reciprocity was to cultivate a measure of power for the community. For reciprocity obligated each to all, and I want you to remember that point. And a failure to reciprocate diminished a community status. Ultimately, even the material utility of the gift was secondary to the creation of the reciprocal relations. Exchanged items were doubly powerful because these items contained both the innate power of the item as well as the spirit of the giver. Successful exchange, like treaty obligations, created alliances and interdependencies between communities, which after 1607 included English colonists. By contrast, from the time they landed in Virginia and settled Jamestown, the English tried to reconstruct Indian identity in English ways. The policy was laid out for Sir Thomas Gates in 1609 when he assumed control of the Jamestown plantation. Gates was instructed to convert Powhatans to tributaries of the English crown. This process involved sovereignty in the land, the education of Indian children as a way of breaking the superstitious influence of native priests, and it also included conversion to the English mercantile economy. The first component of this plan involved gaining title to Indian land. The remainder were cultural objectives that sought to remake tributary peoples religiously and economically. In reality, the plan was ambitious, and the settlers at Jamestown, who struggled for survival themselves, could do little to act on policy statements from London. To fully appreciate and respect and continue the historic treaty agreements and obligations between indigenous peoples and the Commonwealth of Virginia, it is necessary to know what all parties intended when they entered into these binding agreements. This has bearing on the current proposed accord. To be successful today, it is imperative that all parties understand both the indigenous and the Anglo-American sense of propriety and process. This presentation will do 2 things. In the first instance, I've just highlighted the intent of the early engagements by both parties. And now I want to provide a brief history of Virginia treaties, agreements, and legal statutes that intended to protect indigenous rights while securing Virginia settlers' opportunities. Indigenous rights then and now included access to land, access to resources, and access to legal rights. However, across the 17th and 18th centuries, Virginians ignored those treaties, abrogated their agreements, and instead imposed legal statutes that sought to displace Native communities and restrict their access to land, resources, and rights. The legal codes bear this truth. You'll find that I'm sort of skipping over some of the intermittent things that happened between the treaties because there's so much to talk about in relationship to the treaties. Dr. Taylor has done a good job of filling us in on this larger history, so I can kind of move forward. In 1614, I don't know why there's a 4 there, the first treaty under review is the 1614 Chickahominy Treaty, which concluded a period of warfare between the English and the James River Valley chieftains. When Powhatan assented to allow his daughter Pocahontas to marry John Rolfe, which ended the Anglo-Powhatan hostilities, it placed the Chickahominy in a precarious position because they had managed to remain independent of Powhatan's chiefdom. They now faced making a separate peace with the English at Jamestown. Interestingly, the first codicil of the English treaty presented to the Chickahominy revealed English intentions to break tribal identity. The English insisted that the Chickahominy forsake their tribal identity and take the name of Tassentassus, or Englishmen, and be kings of the English subject, or be subject of the English king. It's important to note, as I say here, that the Algonquin word Tassentassus means stranger. And that's what the Englishmen had been called. And so they're asking the Chickahominy to give up their name as Chickahominy and in effect become strangers in the Tidewater Chesapeake. A separate codicil required that whenever Chickahominies came to English forts, they had to proclaim that, quote, the Tassentassens are there, and so coming they shall be at all times be let in and kindly entertained. The additional costs of peace included a refrain from killing any Englishmen or their cattle, providing aid to the English against the Spanish invasion, and paying an annual tribute to the English of 2 bushels of corn for each tribal warrior. For their assent and allegiance, each tribal counselor received a red coat every year, along with a picture of His Majesty, King James, engraved in copper, with a copper chain to hang about his neck, whereby they shall be known to King James as his noblemen. Interestingly. Although copper chains were a great symbolic value in Algonquin culture, even the engraven image of King James and the English promise of peace and amity could not break the ancient bond of community in the Chesapeake Tidewater. Within a year, increasing pressure from Englishmen to supply more corn and more land pressed the Chickahominy into a tenuous alliance with Powhatan and his successor, Opechancanough. In other words, the Chickahominy did not agree to become strangers in their own land. Flash forward, 1646. On October 5th, 1646, after a period of protracted warfare, the defeated Powhatans concluded a general peace with the Virginia and its governor, Sir William Berkeley. This asserted rights of English conquest over all Virginia Indians. Significantly, the Algonquin paramount chieftain was dismantled. Opechancanough had been captured and killed in prison, and his successor at Pamunkey, Nakotawance, represented the paramount chiefdom at its demise. Although Nakotawance was the sole Algonquin representative mentioned in the treaty, his acquiescence affected all Tidewater Algonquin communities equally. Nakotawance acknowledged that Indians now possessed their homelands as vassals of the English king. He acknowledged the sovereignty of the English crown and agreed to pay an annual tribute of 20 beaver skins as an annual recognition of the crown's dominion. Also, it was an annual reminder of the responsibility and rights that tributary status conveyed. Among the responsibilities, the tributaries were required to gain English approval from community leaders. In other words, they had to have their chiefs authorized by the English. The effect was to shift the dependency of village communities from an Algonquin paramount chief to the English crown and his representative in Virginia. The treaty also created independent tribes from the remnants of the Powhatan chiefdom. Now, Virginia provincial and county governments, as well as individuals, could deal directly with particular communities without concern for a paramount chief. To further break the bonds of the chiefdom, Indians were required to vacate the heartland of the Algonquin Alliance, that is, the region between the James and York Rivers. The English were now sole occupants of the Lower Peninsula. Only authorized Indians could enter the area of English settlements, as Dr. Taylor mentioned just a moment ago. This treaty expanded the cultural and legal segregation of Indians from English, which contradicted their stated desire to remake Indians as Englishmen. Nicodemus was to encourage Tidewater Algonquins to send their children, not above 12 years old, to live with the English. Tributary children especially were desired as servants, demonstrating the extent to which the English would go to obtain free labor. By assimilating the children and keeping captive Indians as slaves, Virginians hoped to break traditional Algonquin social influences, namely religion, and thus remake Indians in English ways. Of course, these responsibilities were not without rights. The tributaries were guaranteed military support against their enemies. And it is in this sense that the relationship was viewed as an alliance. The proximity between white and Indian settlement meant that it was in the colony's interest to defend the tributaries from attacks by foreign Indians. The principal right given to tributaries was the freedom to inhabit the north side of the York River without interference from the English. The treaty outlined a pattern of expanding white settlement and demonstrated English desires to ensure that settlement continue in a peaceable manner. Given peace with the Algonquins, immigration to Virginia increased. The English population grew, and the 1646 treaty facilitated settlement among tributary Indians. The defeat and dissolution of Opechancanoug's paramount chiefdom signaled the degradation of all Virginia native people as they were thrust into new accommodations with the English. In the face of rampant speculation in the Rappahannock Valley, the 1646 treaty and subsequent legislation made contradictory attempts to protect Indians from aggressive English settlers. The treaty that I'm talking about was Act 1 of the 1646 legislative session. Act 6 of the 1646 legislative session, which was passed hours or perhaps days later, opened settlement north of the York River. So within just a matter of hours or days, the Virginia legislature was already contradicting itself. These contrary legislations highlight the inability of the Assembly to protect Indian lands. The Assembly's efforts were never intended to defend Indians for long against ambitious settlers. Thus, the pattern was confirmed. Military defeat and political subjugation gave way to greater expropriation of Indian land by Virginians who were not content to remain south of the York River. Here's a map of the Rappahannock River Valley in 1651. And it was in 1651 when the Rappahannock made their first land sale. The werewents of the Rappahannock at that time was a man named Akpataw, and he was the right and true-born king of the Rappahannock Indian town and towns, according to the documents. And he joined with his council of great men, and I think it's important that we say their names. Wionance, Toskiku, Kahaniatari, Pakauta, Mamaguetin, Opatitura, Kakarol James, Minneakataw, Kanasaher. They were invited to open their land to their new brother, the former Burgess from Upper Norfolk County, and religious Puritan, by the way, Moore Fauntleroy. The Rappahannock people had gathered at the river's edge on that day to witness Akapataw welcome Fauntleroy and to accept the gifts that Fauntleroy brought, knowing that these would be distributed to all people. Fauntleroy presented Akapataw and his council with 10 fathom, or roughly 60 feet, of peak and other goods, amounting to about 30 arms length of Roanoke, in exchange for roughly 1/3 of their homeland on the north side of the Rappahannock River. This area is sort of shaded in gray that runs between creeks and all the way to the headwaters of the Middle Peninsula, or of the Northern Neck. To meet the Virginia Assembly's demand for a treaty with the Indians occupants of the land, Akapataw agreed to accompany Fauntleroy to Jamestown to confirm the sale, and to confirm that Fauntleroy was to, quote, to have and hold and enjoy all the aforesaid lands and water so long as the sun and moon endureth. The terms of the land sale provide a lot of evidence about the Rappahannock, their social structure and political structure, and the degree to which English patentees negotiated in Indian ways. That Akapataw could seek the advice of 8 counselors is noteworthy given the degree of population loss among Tidewater Algonquins by mid-century. Regardless, people gathered for the event to receive from Akapataw the Roanoke, Peak, and trade goods that Fauntleroy had brought to exchange for Rappahannock land. It's worth noting that Fauntleroy never fully paid for the land, and the Rappahannock had to continue to take him to court. And finally, Fauntleroy was banned from holding office in Virginia for non-payment. That said, the language of the agreement had envisioned a reciprocal relationship between Fauntleroy and the Rappahannock. However, reciprocity and Anglo-Rappahannock accommodation soon degenerated into an ongoing squabble over land, livestock, encroachment, and non-payment. The brotherly love that Fauntleroy had first acknowledged that the Rappahannock had first acknowledged for Fauntleroy soon turned to contempt. And this pattern of disillusion and displacement replicated across the Middle Peninsula and northern neck of Virginia as native communities and English settlers collided. Within 20 years, nearly every native community in the Chesapeake had withdrawn either inland or up country to escape the tidal wave of English plantation and settlers. And so here's a map that is fairly in focus, that just shows some of the movements of Rappahannock and other tribal peoples, so that you have, Chickahominies moving up into the Mattaponi River region. You have Mattaponis moving northward into the Middle Peninsula. You have groups on the northern neck like the Manchachik and the Chickacolan that are moving further south. This map actually used to continue further out, where you had Wicco-Comicos and others that were being forcibly merged together. In November of, and this happened at such a pace that finally in November of 1652, the Virginia Assembly passed an act stating that there would be no further grants of land to any Englishman whatsoever until Indians first be served with a proportion of 50 acres of land for each bowman. So this is important because this measure demonstrated the attempt by provincial authorities to both reduce the amount of Indian land and to protect what remained from English encroachment. Plus, the Indian apportionment was defined in English terms. 50 acres was the head right received by planters for each indentured servant they imported to the colony. By apportioning land at the same rate for Indians and Englishmen, the Assembly created an Indian head right and began the process of to transform Tidewater Algonquins into subsistence farmers from their former horticultural families. Control of the land and drastic reduction of Indian territory became a primary means through which the English tried to change Indian identity. To prevent an uprising by rapidly displaced native communities on the northern neck, in the summer of 1653, the Virginia Assembly specifically directed Lancaster County to comply with the Indians' Land Act. And thus, in September of 1653, Lancaster County, which you see just sort of on the edge of this map, at that time, Lancaster County really covered what is today Lancaster and Richmond counties. But they concluded a treaty with the Rappahannock Indians, Under the terms of the treaty, both sides agreed that wronged Indians should take their claims to the county court. This is a significant thing in Virginia that's happening, where the primacy of local government, the primacy of county government, is almost superseding that of provincial government, who can't control the situation. The second codicil was that the Werowance and his council would be tried in court for their people stealing English livestock. And so it became lawful, if such Indians were found in English territories, that they be killed. So English murder of Indians was legalized. And thirdly, that reparations for stolen livestock would be acceptable if the Werowance reported the matter promptly. In exchange for the treaty, the Rappahannock Werowance at this time, Torowan, requested that an English house be built for him and his counselors. This treaty did not address English transgressions, nor did it stem the pressure of English settlement. And in fact, the Rappahannock were not passive in this. As they learned what it meant to have English neighbors, to be alienated from ancestral lands, and to have what remained mapped and bounded, English men retaliated frequently against Englishmen. They killed the Englishmen's free-roaming hogs and cattle that ate Indian corn, and the Rappahannock took English tools when they needed them. On November 20th, 1654, the Grand Assembly ordered a defensive march against the Rappahannock. 3 county militias joined together, mustering about 170 men, to march against the Rappahannock Indians. At that meeting, the Rappahannock's Werowance Torowan was killed. And this was the second Werowance to die in 5 years, and the third for whose death the English were directly responsible. Torowan's death marked the end of armed Rappahannock resistance to English settlement. They continued to lose ground with every accommodation they made, but they avoided a militant response. By the mid-1650s, more counties had been created along the Middle Peninsula and the Northern Neck. When Rappahannock County was formed in 1656, one of its first responsibilities was to establish good relations with the local tribal communities. Living there at the time were the Rappahannock and the Mattaponi Indians. Again, these treaties followed. The Rappahannocks were to be treated as Englishmen in county court. The Werowance and his council were required to appear in court for transgressions that their people may have committed. There were issues that were involving the livestock, and also the county commissioners promised good treatment to any Indian children that were sent to them. These were difficult adjustments for the Mattaponi and the Rappahannock alike, where they could hunt, fish, oyster, plant, and gather, had now been circumscribed by alien laws and customs. The Werowances had agreed to provisions that they may have understood poorly. Both tribes intended to remain on their land, and doing so meant they had to learn how to accommodate their English neighbors. As they looked around to their native neighbors on the Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck, they could see the effect of resisting English settlement. And so we go through the 1650s and the 1660s with increasingly heightened tensions. The Virginia Assembly tries to pass in the early 1660s, late 1650s and early 1660s, acts for civilizing Indians, acts for working with Indians. None of them are successful in stemming the tide of violence against native communities on the Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck. And as Dr. Taylor mentioned, the effect of that was the violence of Bacon's Rebellion. And so at the conclusion of Bacon's Rebellion, Cococoasque presented herself to the royal commissioners sent to investigate the rebellion. She claimed that she represented, quote, several scattered nations of Indians. And also, she quote, desired those Indians to be reduced under her subjection as anciently they had been. Although the documents do not specifically identify the Mattaponi, the Chickahominy, and the Rappahannock as the scattered nations to whom she referred, those three groups did not sign the subsequent peace treaty between the English and the Algonquins. Instead, they are identified as, quote, the several Indian nations under her subjection. By contrast, the Nanzatico, who lived further up the Rappahannock River, their Werowance Botanicus was very clear about who he represented. He signed the treaty as kings of the Nanzatico, the Rappahannock River Nansmans, and the Portobagos. The treaty was signed at Middle Plantation in May of 1677. The commissioner perhaps most responsible for the treaty was Colonel Francis Morrison, who had been Governor Berkeley's former lieutenant governor. In fact, the 1677 Articles of Peace very closely resemble the Indian laws codified under Morrison when he was lieutenant governor in March 1662. In both the 1662 Act concerning Indians and the 1677 Articles of Peace, Morrison used precisely the same language when he acknowledged that, quote, mutual discontents, complaints, jealousies, and fears of English and Indians proceed chiefly from the violent intrusions of diverse English made into Indian lands. He knew that there was never any evidence that neighbor Indians committed acts of violence against the Virginia settlers, even though they received the brunt of Bacon's revenge. In broad terms, the Treaty of Middle Plantation reaffirmed Indians' tributary status along the lines of Berkeley's 1646 treaty and Morrison's 1662 Act concerning Indians. Once again, colonial officials promised Indians would be protected by the laws of England and Virginia as if such hurt had been done to any Englishman. In some respects, the Anglo-Indian relationship returned to the pre-1676 status quo antebellum, much of which had been codified under Morrison. For example, tributaries still had to obtain badges. Servants could no longer be indentured for longer than the term for a term of servitude longer than what an Englishman could be bound out for. They could not be sold as slaves. And finally, Morrison tried to enforce the 3-mile boundary around Indian towns. In other respects, however, the Treaty of Middle Plantation marked a significant departure from the previous 30 years of Virginia Indian policy. The Royal Commissioners took local control of Indian affairs away from county officials. For 3 decades, county surveyors had prescribed Indian land, and county courts concluded separate treaties with groups like the Rappahannock, Morotacan, and Mattaponi. Now Indians would have their lands confirmed to them and their posterity by patent under the seal of His Majesty's colony. Also, the Royal Commissioners agreed that if Indian communities did not have sufficient land to plant, that the colony would provide them with additional land. Instead of relying on county courts to redress individual wrongs, Royal Commissioners encouraged Indians to take their complaints directly to the governor of Virginia. This would ensure that Indians remained protected in their persons and property. Each of these changes proclaimed the inability of frontiersmen and government officials to deal fairly with Indians. The most significant alteration to Indian policy was the commissioners' attempt to recreate some semblance of Powhatan and Opequacankanew's paramount chiefdom that had dominated the Chesapeake Tidewater since before the English had arrived. When Berkeley dismantled that chiefdom in 1646, he ended the Pamunkeys' dominance over Tidewater Algonquins in order to divide and isolate Virginia tribes. However, the revenge of foreign Indians from the outside of Virginia and the vigilantism of Virginia frontiersmen had forced various communities to come together for mutual support and defense. And this provided an opportunity for the Pamunkey to reassert themselves as the paramount chiefdom. At the peace, Cococoes used that loose association to press for an acknowledgement of her as the paramount chief. The document actually says, and I'm trying to paraphrase it here, that each Indian king and queen shall have equal power to govern their people, and none have greater power than the other except the queen of Pamunkey, to whom several scattered Indians do now again owe their ancient subjection, and are agreed to come in and plant themselves under her power. Again, the Rappahannock, the Chickahominy, and the Mattaponi are not mentioned by name, but Cococoes tried to assert her dominance and collect tribute from them. By January of 1678, some of the young men from Chickahominy still refused to acknowledge their supposed Pamunkey overlords, or pay the tribute that Cococoes demanded. These young men complained that the Chickahominy elders had forced them to accept Pamunkey oversight. And in protest, these young men fled into the woods where they lie about and will not come in. That summer, when Cococoes tried to collect tribute from those under her subjection, she encountered further resistance. At first, they refused to pay their tribute, and then she complained that the Rappahannock and Chickahominy would not obey her orders. By August, these three nations had complained about the Pamunkeys' demand for tribute, and the tribes argued that they had not paid tribute to the Pamunkey these 36 years since the conquest of Opechancanough, and they still refused to pay it. After this period, we enter a period where increasingly there's pressure from foreign Indians. And when I say that, I'm talking about tribes from the north, particularly the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Susquehannock. Peoples are coming down and raiding the Virginia frontier. And between 1699 and 1706, there's a series of events that dramatically redirected Anglo-Indian relations in Virginia. Over these 7 years, provincial and local governments curtailed the rights of Indians to negotiate with foreign Indians, to resist encroachments by English settlers, to have a voice in colonial court and council, and finally to exist as Indians at all. In November 1699, rumors began to spread that foreign Indians intended to raid the Virginia frontier. In response, several of those Virginia tributaries, the Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Rappahannock, and Nanzatico, planned to make independent peace with their northern foes. When the Virginia Colonial Council discovered their plans, the councilors summoned the great men from each of the tribal towns involved to appear before the governor and council in Jamestown. The great men appeared in February of 1700, where they acknowledged their plans in full intent. The Virginia Council was displeased that Indians had planned a secret peace and ordered them to withdraw their plans, and it confiscated their belts of peak, which were to be used in negotiations with the Iroquois. Once again, the provincial government had interfered with Algonquin men's traditional role as warriors and diplomats. Without these belts, the Algonquin emissaries would have no diplomatic authority at the Iroquoian Council. The Virginia Council had promised to return the belts to the tributaries when they paid their tribute, and thus demonstrated their allegiance and peaceful allegiance to the Provincial Virginia Council. Tributary Indians could pledge their goodwill to the governor and council when it came to foreign Indians, but that did little to stop the tension between Indians and those Englishmen who coveted their land. In 1704, the Nanzatico Indians complained to the Colonial Council that a neighbor named Thomas Kendall had broken down their fence and turned off their land and turned them off their land. The Nanzatico petitioned for new land, but the council referred to the complaint to the House of Burgesses, and there was no response. A second complaint by the Nanzatico against another Englishman was also ignored. From all sides, the Nanzatico felt under attack by their English neighbors, and finally they had had enough. In August of 1704, 10 Nanzatico men attacked and murdered John Rowley and his family in their home. Immediately, the militia of Richmond County went after the Nanzatico. By this time, the Nanzatico had already abandoned their town, and after they were tracked for several days, they were found hiding in the woods. 49 men, women, and children were rounded up, marched to Richmond County, where they faced a trial of Oyer and Terminer. The English decided to make an example out of Nanzatico, so the council ordered that a court be held in Richmond. 7 were found guilty and hanged immediately. The rest of the Nanzatico men and women were jailed in Williamsburg for the winter. And then in 1705, the Assembly decided to invoke a 1665 law that made the entire community answerable with, quote, their lives and their liberties for any murders that were committed by the English. This was the first time that the Virginia Council had invoked this harsh law. After these 7 men were hanged, the surviving men and women were sold into slavery in Antigua, as Dr. Taylor mentioned. The children under 12 years of age were bound out to the councilmen, to the Virginia Council members, and not allowed to return to their homeland upon penalty of death. And then 5 months later, in October of 1705, the Virginia Assembly did for every Indian nation what it had done to the Nanzatico. The Virginia government disappeared the natives and did away with the rights of Indians. Indeed, the very identity of every nation was erased from the law. The Burgesses asserted that Virginia was a biracial society by associating in the legal statutes all non-whites through passage of Virginia's first black codes. Non-whites could no longer hold office, nor could they be witness in court. Indian servants could no longer sue English masters for their freedom when held beyond their term of service. Nor could Indians complain to the courts when they were abused by their masters. Tributary governments could no longer sue the Englishmen who defaulted on their leases. Non-whites, bond or free, could not lift their hand against opposition to any Christian. The Black Codes erased 6 decades of Indian treaties that guaranteed Indians status as Englishmen in courts. Indians disappeared quickly from the extant historical record when they were barred from participating in the dominant forms of legal, economic, social, and political interaction. When the Virginia colony no longer recognized the treaty rights of indigenous people, they were without status in Virginia. Increasingly, local government and provincial government no longer acknowledged or approved tribal communities or their leaders. Without recognized leaders and without individual rights, Native peoples could no longer petition the county court or the colonial council. In short, there was no redress for the Rappahannock Indians, or for tribal Indians, period. The demise of political recognition diminished the influence of tribal Werowances and Kakawasu's. The political survival of these leaders depended upon their ability to mediate forces outside the community. That included both colonial governments and foreign Indians. Instead, the Virginia Council intruded into intertribal diplomacy and confiscated belts of peak. Without access to either council fires or council men, rulers ceased to have roles outside their community. Inside their community, their value changed. They began to take care of their communities internally, but they had no role outside their communities, or they had limited role outside of their communities during this time. Unfortunately, this emphasis on the political structure and survival of the tribal chiefdom has overshadowed the deeper structural foundations of Algonquin life in the Tidewater that continued long after Algonquin political chiefdoms began their decline. For the English and their contemporaries and their historians, the political chiefdom has been the most recognizable evidence of group structure. Observers then and now have focused on this component of Algonquin society and concluded that in the absence of clear, uninterrupted political leadership, the group could not survive. They were wrong. For centuries now, the Virginia tribes and their chiefs and their counselors have worked, at times quietly, at other times vocally, to defend their nationhood and their sovereignty. And this is evidenced by their survival from that day to this. Native peoples have a future that is shaped by their history, their activism, and their vision. They are guided by generations that preceded them and encouraged by those to come. To be clear, 400 years of increasingly restrictive treaties and legislations did not unravel the tribal and community structures that existed long before Englishmen arrived on these shores. Indeed, the bonds were strengthened. The central question that lies before us today is, how do tribes undo the demands that colonial sovereignty has made? From my perspective, it's all about restoration. It's all about progress. And it's all about learning the lessons of reciprocity. That is the opportunity with which we are now presented. Thank you.